I want you to imagine for a moment that someone you know and respect shows a personal interest in you and encourages you to become part of a, let's say, a local chapter of a national organization supporting a particular candidate for president. Oh, no, you don't have to imagine. It's probably happened probably half a dozen times, maybe on Facebook, maybe. Well, let's just suppose you've heard of this candidate before. You don't really know much about him, but you have a feeling that maybe he can solve some of the problems you are facing in your life. But is that feeling enough? Don't you want to know what he stands for? Don't you want to know what he has said about how he understands the world and its problems, about the particulars of his plan for putting things right? Well, hopefully you would. Well, I share this just because last Sunday we focused some on some scriptures from Matthew's Gospel of Jesus' invitation to some fishermen. Later on, an invitation to a tax collector where he said, "Come and follow me." And we talked about how that invitation is extended to all of us, and that God desires for us to say yes to his call to come and follow him. And I hope that as we reflect on that call, that yes, we do have a deep sense that there is life and there is hope, and that there is answers to life's deepest questions in this person who calls us to follow him. That there is meaning and purpose and so much to be found in him. But do you really know what he stands for? Maybe it's important that we spend some time to reflect on some of what he has said. How well do you know what Jesus has said? It's not a trick question. It's not meant to shame or embarrass anybody. It's just meant to make us think a little bit. Well, what would you expect Jesus to have said? Maybe you don't know the Gospels real well. You can think of a couple statements, but what do you imagine Jesus said to people? What was his message? Well, wasn't it basically be nice, go to church? Is that pretty much it? Would that get you crucified? Tell people to be nice and go to church? I want to suggest that there's a lot more to it than that. And I want to suggest that there was a lot about the message of Jesus that ought to make us step back a little bit. That I'm going to use the word radical. A little bit out of the ordinary, a little bit cross currents with popular culture or even popular theology of his day, popular notions about God, even within the faith community. There are a lot of things that Jesus said that made you stop and think. How well do you know what Jesus said? Well, maybe a place to start is to ask a different question. How well do you know how people reacted to what Jesus said? Let me read just a couple of different statements from the Gospels of people's reactions to particular teachings or parables or conversations. In Matthew 7, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Something different, something that got their attention, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike their teachers of religious law. That was one response. Luke chapter 4, verse 28 and following. When they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him and forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built. They intended to push him over the cliff, but he passed right through the crowd and went on his way. Wow. I didn't know talking could get you in that much trouble. Or from John 8, at that point they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden from them and left the temple. Or later on, once again the people picked up stones to kill him. Jesus said, at my Father's direction, I have done many good works. For which one are you going to stone me? They replied, we're stoning you not for any good work, but for blasphemy. You, a mere man, claim to be God. From Matthew 21, when the leading priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was telling the story against them. They were the wicked farmers. They wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds who considered Jesus to be a prophet. The very next chapter, Matthew 22, in response to something Jesus taught, his reply amazed them and they went away. A paragraph later, when the crowds heard him, they were astounded at his teaching. Well, maybe you do know what Jesus said. Maybe you know too well. Maybe we all do. Maybe we've stopped being astounded at his teaching because it's too familiar. Well, my guess is we're not all at exactly the same point here this morning. But my guess is that all of us, if we have our hearts and ears and minds open, could stand to be astounded a little bit. And it would be good for us to hear again and to really listen and to appreciate some of the radical nature, some of the ways that the teachings of Jesus are not like every other teaching that comes down the road. And to be able to hear them for what they really are intended to say. And so my plan over the next couple of months as we lead up to Easter, and I know that's still a ways away, and we still no doubt have some winter time to go through, some winter weather, which we've experienced very little of so far. But to take the next 9 or 10 weeks and to look specifically from Matthew's Gospel, because those of you, if you're doing the reading according to the schedule we made available a few weeks ago, you're going to be spending the next couple of months in Matthew's Gospel. And so we're going to draw from Matthew's Gospel some of the different teachings of Jesus that may especially have a little bit of that astounding nature to them, that radical nature to them, even though at first listen they might sound pretty tame. We're going to start with the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to start with the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. We call this collection of statements the Beatitudes. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, it comes from like late Middle English, from Old French or Latin or something where the word really means blessed. Okay? So that should not be a stumbling block. So don't worry about the Beatitude label. We're familiar, we've heard these, we read them this morning, perhaps in a little different language. We're used to hearing blessed are, right? And how many of us talk like that? Wow, I'm really blessed. Well, no, we say I'm blessed, right? Because we say I'm blessed, it means I realize I've received something and I feel grateful. And so we say I'm blessed, which kind of means I have been blessed. Someone has given something to me, right? But we don't use the word blessed. There's some church traditions that talk about like the Blessed Mary or the blessed this person or that person. Well, what does that mean? That's kind of a title of reverence. Is that what's going on here? Well, let me just read through them. The language that we read, you can open your bulletin if you want, or in the Bible, we're in Matthew chapter 5. One day as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him and he began to teach them. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Perhaps what is most unusual, radical, maybe confusing or frightening or comforting about this passage, about these teachings of Jesus is not simply that Jesus talked about people who are poor or grieving or humble or hungry or merciful or persecuted. It's more in what he said about those people, and specifically what he said collectively. I like reading from different translations, and I've done a lot lately from the New Living Translation, but I think this translation that we've read this morning only gives a part of the picture. God blesses those who. Now that's true. I believe that. But if that's all that we hear, that God's heart is open towards these people to try to comfort them, I think there's so much more going on than that. This is not just an encouragement for all of us to feel sorry for those who are poor or humble or mourn or who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's not calling us, it's not saying they need to be blessed like we should just say a prayer for them. It's not saying how deserving of help are those who are poor in spirit, or those who are humble, or those who are merciful. You take a dozen different translations and you'll find a lot of other words used here, because it gets kind of complicated to know just how to translate this, how to express it in English. And you find translations like, "Oh, the happiness of." That's not talking about God just feeling sorry for, and so he's going to try to give some comfort to. This is saying, "Oh, the happiness of those who are poor in spirit. Oh, the happiness of those who grieve. Oh, the happiness of those who are pure in heart. Oh, the happiness of those who are meek or who are humble." Other translations use the term, "Oh, how fortunate." That kind of comes along with the idea of how blessed in the way that we often use the term. Oh, how blessed, how fortunate are these people. How lucky can you get? And if you're with me now, you should be saying or thinking, you've got to be kidding. Lucky? No, lucky is those dozens of people who won $1 million in the lottery. That's lucky. And Jesus says, no, it's not. See, this is not by accident. Jesus is not confused here. Jesus is trying to tell it straight. Jesus is trying to give the truth that the world cannot see. Let's talk about winning the lottery for a moment. Boy, that would solve all your problems, wouldn't it? Not really. Not according to Jesus. You know, there's some confusion or disagreement about what Jesus actually said in that first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, we're used to hearing. You go over and read Luke's record of it, and he just says, blessed are the poor. All right, so what are we going to do about that? Which is it? I think it's probably both. Poor in spirit certainly would be talking about those who recognize their spiritual poverty. What I mean by that is it's kind of the opposite of the arrogant, self-righteous person who says, oh, I'm really spiritual. I've got everything just right with God. You remember the story of the two men in the temple, and the one who was a proud Pharisee who stood up and prayed, God, I thank you for, and he spelled out his resume. I pray this many times a day. I give my money to the poor. I go without food twice a week. See, that's not poor in spirit. That's arrogant and that's self-righteous. I think poor in spirit kind of speaks a little bit of being broken in spirit. When you're broken, when you're humble, like the other man in the temple who just fell on his face and said, God, have mercy to me, I'm a sinner. That's poor in spirit. And who's the most fortunate? The tax collector or the Pharisee in that story? Who is poised for the greatest real happiness? Well, the one who's broken. The one who's humble before God. But what about the money thing? Does it apply there too? Absolutely it does. You know, there's a proverb where the writer says, it's a prayer. He says, God, give me neither poverty nor riches. You go, wait a minute, I understand the first part. I've never prayed not to be rich. I mean, that's the desire of all of our hearts. You know, it kind of goes back to Fiddler on the Roof. If I were a rich man, yada, 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 right? Boy, if only. But no, this wisdom says, I pray neither for poverty nor riches because I know by human heart, I know the tendency that if I'm poor, I'm going to be tempted to steal. And if I steal, I'm going to dishonor the name of my God. Wow. That's a cool perspective, isn't it? And if I'm rich, the temptation's going to be different. I'm going to be tempted to forget God and say, I don't really need anybody. I've got everything myself. And I might forget the Lord. He says, I don't want that either. Later, Jesus said something else a little bit harsh, a little bit radical. Right along there with, if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross and follow me. He said, what should a man gain what should he have if he gained the whole world but lose his own soul in the process? And I don't think that's just talking about losing our soul eternally. I think it's talking about losing who we are. And what's really most important, and I think we begin to see this through the Beatitudes, and we realize that the most important thing is not what we have. It's not these external things. It's who we are. It's the character of our lives. Remember a couple months ago, I shared a quote from, I think it was Matthew Henry, a Bible scholar, wrote a lot of commentaries, who back in like the 1700s or something was accosted by a robber, and his purse was stolen. And remember how he responded to that? There were like several things, and I didn't look this up again this morning. I was trying to think what this was. You know, he was grateful, and there were like 4 things he thanked God for. You know, one, that he'd never been robbed before. And one was, though they took all I had, they didn't take my life. And the third was, though they took all I had, it wasn't much. But the fourth one's the one I want to focus on. Although I was robbed, I'm not the one who robbed. You remember that? Do we understand that? When we talk about being fortunate, when we talk about, the happiness of, we talk about the radical message of Christ that he's offering us when he calls us to follow him. He says, don't set your sight on all these other things that aren't important. He's trying to help us have a right perspective in life that recognizes the greatest happiness, the blessedness, the fortunate nature of those whose hearts are in the right place. It's who we are. It's who God helps us to be. And so when we start talking about those who are broken and humble before God, not self-righteous and filled with our our own ego and a high estimation of ourselves. We start talking about those who mourn. You say, well, how does that fit in? How is it godly to grieve? Well, I think part of what he's talking about is there's a lot in life that should break our hearts. I'm not talking about just our own struggles. I mean the struggles of other people. And those who mourn, there's a lot of heartache in life. And we can look around us and we can see people who are trying to live a perpetual party. God says if that's where our heart is, we're going to miss an awful lot. There's a lot of reason to mourn. There's a lot that's not right in the world. But he promises if we are mourning over the things that are worth mourning over, if we are mourning over the pain in the world, God promises there will be comfort. If we're mourning over things that have happened in our lives, but we're looking to him, there will be comfort. And part of that comfort comes in having an eternal perspective on things and understanding, as we've been talking over the past few months, that we have the potential of being part of God's story. And in God's story, no tear is ever wasted as God is at work in our lives and through our lives to touch others. We're not going to spend a lot of time just elaborating each one of these, but as we go through the list, we think about those who are meek or humble. And again, the world gets a very different message. The world says, no, the way to fulfillment is to assert yourself. The way to fulfillment is to take what you can get. The way to fulfillment is to be first in line and to try to be first in everything. And Jesus says, no, if you want to be great, you want to find true greatness, you learn to be a servant. He's not calling us to weakness. Sometimes the bully is the weakest one, right? It takes great strength to be a servant. It takes great strength to live a life of meekness, to put others first, to be humble in the face of whatever we might experience from other people. It takes a lot of strength. But that's the strength Christ calls us to. To be hungry for righteousness, for justice. Don't have time this morning to talk about just even distinguishing those two. Righteousness we tend to think of in terms of the character in our lives. What is right, and we hunger for that. We long to be characterized as a person who does what is right by other people. Justice focuses a little bit more on other people and people being treated the way they ought to be treated. And I think the two of them go together, that when we're doing what's right, we're going to be treating other people with justice, with the respect that they deserve. And part of our calling is more than hungering after winning the lottery, that we hunger after things to be right and other people to be treated fairly. And we hunger after justice for all people. We hunger after righteousness to be lived out in our lives, where we'd rather be robbed than to be the one doing the robbing. And it goes along with God's blessing attached to those who are merciful. Not requiring that everyone else pay the penalty that we think they ought to pay, but to be characterized by the mercy of God as we relate to other people. To be quick to forgive, to have that character in our lives. And it says, oh, the fortune, oh, the blessedness, oh, the happiness of the merciful, because they're going to receive mercy in return. The pure in heart, always aware of our motivations and always seeking to have love at the center of all that we do. The peacemakers, those who are seeking peace in every situation, called the children of God. Well, that's interesting. You know, in that culture, that you called someone, James and John were called the sons of thunder. Why do you think that was? Probably because there was something in their personality that was a little bit strong and boisterous. And it's like, okay, James and John remind us of thunder. And so we call them the sons of thunder. Well, you're called a child of God. You're called a children of God. Children of God, that kind of implies there's something in the way that you're conducting yourself that is godlike, right? That's what it's saying there, that those who are seeking peace are reflecting something of the heart of God. What about those who are persecuted? Persecuted for doing right. Again, it's part of God's story. It's part of preferring to be robbed than to rob. Later in the New Testament, some of the letters are written about this. Make sure that we're not persecuted for doing wrong. Make sure that if you get in trouble, it's not because you brought it on yourself. But if you get in trouble for doing the right thing, you can entrust that to God and trust yourself to God. Know that you did what was right. Trust God to take care of the outcome. It won't always be right. It won't always be just in this life, but God will make it right. Blessed are those who are persecuted for doing right, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You're part of something bigger. It'll never be taken away from you. And then it's as though Jesus addresses this crowd, those who would follow him, that he's calling to be broken and to be tuned into the pain of the world, to be seeking peace, to be hungering after righteousness and justice, to be meek, to be humble. Doesn't quite sound like an army that's going to conquer, does it? But he looks at these people that he's just said, here's what I value. Here's what God values. Here's what's going to bring you the greatest happiness. And he says, now I want you to go change the world. He says, I want you to be salt. Salt that brings flavor. I want your presence in the world as you live out these character qualities. I want your presence to make a difference for good in the lives of people you encounter. I don't want you to hide who you are or whose you are or who you follow. I want you to be lights in the world, not spotlights shining in people's eyes and blinding them, but candles. Lights to light their way, to show them the obstacles in their path, to show them by your life, by God living in you, to show them a better way, to show them truth, to show them life as Christ lives through you. Don't hide it under a bushel. Get out there and change the world as you live for the kingdom of God. Let your light shine before men so that they may see your lives, see the character of your life, see the difference of your life, see the radical nature of the teaching that has found its way to the center of your life. Let your light shine that they may see that and give glory to your Father in heaven. A little radical, yeah. A little confusing, maybe in parts. Intriguing? Boy, I sure hope so. I hope it begins to ring true. It's another way of living, a different way of living that Christ calls us to. It's not just be nice and go to church. I hope you do both of those things. But it's so much more. And we've just gotten started.